Up until now, we have seen a few counterexamples of which we have highlighted the abstractness of the setting. The sheriff, the grandfather, the abstract organ transplant, and the utility monster. We have then argued that a moral theory may be constructed with the simple aim that it works in our universe, disregarding any example that is unrealistic with respect to the natural world as we know it. This is a fine defense, but now we wish to give an interesting additional argument that addresses all these examples. And this additional argument rests on how a moral counterexample is constructed. So how is a counterexample constructed? The standard form comes from mathematics. In mathematics, if one makes a broad statement, a theorem, another mathematician can construct an example that does not obey the broad statement given by the theorem. Then the two mathematicians check the example to see if its construction is possible. If it is, they then check the theorem to find the mistake in the proof. They know there must be an error in the theorem because they are working under a shared understanding of the axioms that govern their theory. Instead, when dealing with moral counterexamples, there is a difference, in that when checking the supposed counterexample, we are not weighing it against a common pre-agreed upon framework, but against our moral intuitions. And moral intuitions can differ from person to person. They can change with age and with time and place. For example, Peter Singer's moral intuitions tell him that in the sheriff counterexample, one should frame an innocent person. For him, right off the gate, the sheriff counterexample is not a counterexample, because its conclusion does not clash with his intuitions. Additionally, studies have shown that moral intuitions can vary with the framing of a moral dilemma. If one uses the word kill in a moral dilemma rather than save, people tend to judge the action presented in the dilemma as being worse, and rationally we understand that the morality of an action should not depend on how it is worded. But even without a scientific paper, we know that moral intuitions can be dubious. For some, having tattoos can be seen as quite immoral. For others, masturbation could be immoral. While there are people for which the writing in the ending of Game of Thrones was perfectly moral, and we all know that to be false. So can we rely on moral intuitions alone as a consistent basis to judge a moral theory upon? People's moral intuitions can be all over the place. Previously, we have given for granted that our moral intuitions are the correct yardstick to evaluate a moral action. A concept that we will introduce in this video is that although our moral intuitions are important, and for us they do encapsulate a deeper moral truth, they can misfire or be misleading, and we should re-evaluate how much and in which way we should rely on them when constructing a moral theory. But let's not run ahead. In the course of our journey, we will get to know our moral intuitions better. As a starter, where do they come from anyway? First, it is widely accepted that many of our moral intuitions are due to evolution. For instance, Peter Singer suggests that features of human morality could have grown out of simple reciprocal practices, such as the mutual removal of parasites from awkward places. And many similar accounts have been hypothesized. It also appears undeniable that culture plays a role in shaping our moral intuitions. This seems practically self-evident, so we will not prolong the discussion by stating some platitudes. For others, our moral intuitions could represent some objective truth. The main takeaway from these explanations that will be of interest for us in this video is that our moral intuitions appear to be, at the very least in part, constructed, taking into account properties of our universe. Thus, if one provides an abstract example with a conclusion that is at odds with our moral intuition, how do we know that our intuitions are judging the setting appropriately? We know they can go astray in other cases. Why should they be on point in an unrealistic scenario? What we know about them does not really lead us to believe that they would function well in a setting that was far removed from our reality. Quite the opposite. Take for example a possible world where those who are stabbed with a knife gain immediately a stronger body, more wisdom and happiness, with no pain. Then utilitarianism would tell us that stabbing people in that universe is good, while our moral intuitions might remain tepid to the idea that stabbing is good, and given their ordinary place of functioning, rightly so. We are stating that applying our moral intuitions to unnatural settings may lead us to wrong conclusions, given that their usual environment of application is the natural world as we know it. So if our moral intuitions alone judge the conclusion of an abstract counterexample as being immoral, this could very well not even be a problem. Notice how the defense we have just given is different than the one in which we reject abstract counterexamples on the grounds that a moral theory is constructed for empirical cases based solely on our universe. They are two separate rebuttals. Additionally, the newest defense we have provided could possibly open the door to utilitarianism being right in all possible worlds. Since even if some things may seem intuitively wrong in a universe not subject to our laws, one could suspect the intuitions to be unreliable, thus holding little substance. So he who wants his moral theory to function in any conceivable universe could be pleasantly surprised by such a line of thinking, since he could say that the problems posed by impossible counterexamples do not need to be addressed by his moral theory, given that they are created by the mismatch between the intended setting of our moral intuitions and the environment of the possible worlds. Combo! Lovely, an addendum. The argument we have just given can also be extended to realistic cases that are exotic or very improbable. To exemplify, if we were to ask an individual in the Stone Age, where does he stand on copyright laws, it would not be surprising if his moral intuitions would be off the mark on this matter, or lead him to nonsensical explanations. This is because his moral intuitions are fine-tuned to his life and its setting, so they may not be the most reliable, just as what may happen in the case of impossible counterexamples, even though the setting here is realistic but exotic. Interesting, okay. Now, this whole discussion immediately begs a question that we will just touch upon here. If we can't always trust our moral intuitions, on what do we base a theory of morality? Well, there are many schools of thought. There are those who say that moral intuitions should be disregarded almost entirely, and that one should base himself just about completely on something else, like reason. Others instead would disagree with the whole premise of putting under scrutiny our moral intuitions, and would translate descriptive moral intuitions directly into a normative framework. These would quite likely disagree with the rebuttal presented in this video holding any validity. Lastly, there are those who believe that we should be wary of considering our moral intuitions as gospel, even though they do hold importance. They incorporate deeper truths or underlying principles, and they need to be accurately analyzed. Maybe they can be distilled or accompanied by reason. We find ourselves in this final camp, but we are now going off topic. The point here was to provide an additional thought-provoking rebuttal against impossible counterexamples. On everything else we will elaborate more in other videos.